Welcome to our study in the book of Zechariah as a part of the prophecy series. We're going to start for the next 6 lessons, including this lesson, a look at the Old Testament minor prophet Zechariah. It is a pretty significant book if you want to understand the second coming of Jesus Christ. It's often a book that might be referred to in several ways, and we're going to see that when we get into the text. But it is often a book that is neglected. It's a book that tells us some specific things about the Antichrist, and it's also going to tell us some specific things about the Jews in those last days before the return of Jesus Christ. So I think it's very important for us to look at this book. Now, as with everything in the prophecy series, we're going to look at the whole book. We're not just going to focus on the prophetic passages themselves, although we will end up there as we go through this study. We want to understand the whole book of the prophet, because with that, it gives us an understanding when we see the flow and the timeline, as well as the direction of the prophecy and what is being said. So with today's lesson, we're going to do basically an introduction to the book of Zechariah. So what we want to begin with, first of all, is the historical background. We want to take a look at the historical background to this book. And so what I've done is I've included a map for you of the Medo-Persian Empire around 500 BC. This would be the empire that was in power, the world power that was dominating Israel and the area of the Mediterranean at the time. And we need to understand this as far as what is happening in this book. So that helps us to see that Zechariah is a post-exilic prophet. Now, when I say exilic, I mean exile. Post-exilic means after the exile. Which exile, George? Well, the exile of Jerusalem and Judea to Babylon, which was for 70 years when they were taken into exile by Babylon. Remember, the Babylonians then were defeated by the Medo-Persian Empire. So this would be post-exilic, after the exile. And Zechariah is a post-exilic prophet. Now, let's talk about the prophet now. And so when we talk about the prophet, we're going to look at several things. First of all, his name. It's very important to understand his name. So here's what I want you to see. The name Zechariah means whom Jehovah remembers. That's what his name means. Understand that in the Hebrew culture, their names had meaning. So his name meant whom Jehovah remembers. Now, it is interesting, though, that Zechariah was a popular name among the Hebrews. So this is one of those names that would be very popular. So for instance, in our culture, John is a very popular name in our culture among men. Now, so when we talk about the Old Testament, here's what I want you to see. There are at least 27 men bearing the name that are mentioned in the Old Testament. So if you were to look at the Old Testament, if you were to get out a concordance or do a search through some sort of engine or whatever, you're going to find that there are 27 times that this name is mentioned by 27 different individuals. They're not all the same person. They lived at different time periods. And so we're going to see that. All right, let's talk about his home. Let's talk about where he is from. So this is a post-exilic prophet. Give us a little bit more information here, his home. Well, the home of the prophet Zechariah is unknown, as he was born in Babylon. So when we talk about it, Zechariah, I can't specifically tell you what part of Judea or Judah his family came from. But what we know is that when his family was in exile in Babylon, Zechariah was born there. Remember, they were there for 70 years. So we don't know where he's from. Although, when we look at the context of the book, it points to Jerusalem. So when we look at the book, it very much appears that Zechariah, even though we don't know where he came from, is at that point living in Jerusalem. He's a part of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So let's continue on in our discussion of the prophet, and what we're going to see is his background and occupation. We need to understand a little bit about his background and what does Zechariah do. Now, in understanding that, we need to take a look and see this, that the prophet identifies himself as the son of Berechiah, son of Iddu. That's what he identifies himself. So what does that tell us? Well, he was of priestly descent. So he was of the tribe of Levi, specifically from the sons of Aaron. He was from the priestly families. So this kind of tells you a little bit about what his occupation was. So he was a part of a group of priests who returned to Jerusalem with Zerubbabel. Now, Zerubbabel is a son of David who is from the lineage of David, who will end up being the governor of Judea or Judah. And this is going to be very important when we go through the text itself, the book of Zechariah. Now, we can cross-reference this with a couple of different passages. So, for instance, you can see this mentioned in Ezra chapter 5, verse 1, chapter 6, verse 14, as well as in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 12, verse 16. Now, when we talk about his occupation, we see that he is a priest, but now he's a prophet as well. So he was called to be a prophet in order to assist Haggai as the people were called to finish the temple. Now, Haggai, we have the book of Haggai in the Old Testament, was another prophet. This prophet, Zechariah, was called to assist Haggai in getting the people to finish the temple. His ministry began 2 months after Haggai began his ministry. So the text is very clear when we see that he began his ministry 2 months after Haggai. So he's there to assist Haggai. Now, what do we know about the prophet concerning the date of the prophecy? So here's what I want you to see. The prophecies in chapters 1 to 8 were spoken in the years 520 to 518. 520 to 518. We know that from the text. The prophecies from chapter 9 through chapter 11 have no date, although chapter 9 will talk about it taking a few months after the prior vision in chapter 8. So basically for that portion of the prophecy, we don't know anything about the date of it. Now, let's talk about the nature of the prophecy, the nature of this prophetic book. And what I want you to see here is this. The book of Zechariah is the longest of the 12 prophets and the most difficult to interpret. In fact, when you and I look at this prophecy together, some of the imagery is going to be very similar to the imagery that we see in the New Testament, the book of Revelation. Not that they are the same prophecies or speak to the same things, but it makes it very difficult to interpret, to understand what's going on. The book of Zechariah is the most messianic and the most eschatological of the Old Testament books. So when we talk about the book of Zechariah, it's going to talk a lot about the Messiah, the coming king. It's also going to talk a lot about eschatology and the coming of the king and the final judgment and the conclusion of all things. This book is the most messianic and most eschatological of Old Testament books. Now, one thing we see about Zechariah as compared to the other prophets that we see in Scripture is that, especially the Old Testament, is that he differs from the other prophets in that he emphasizes visions as a means of divine communication. So, for instance, he's going to focus on a series of visions in the beginning part of the book. A significant portion of the book is given to these visions that he has seen, where God is communicating prophetic material to him. Now, in his book, the Messiah is presented as the branch or the sprout of David. These are the terms that are used in the book to refer to the Messiah. Now, what I also want you to see is this, is that Messiah comes as a king who is lowly in spirit and providing salvation for the people. That's what we're going to see in this book. And that seems to be pretty much a description about Jesus Christ. We're also going to see in this book that the Messiah is rejected as shepherd, sold for a price, and in fact it tells you the price, and pierced for the sheep. Again, very much pointing to what we would know now to be Jesus Christ and his sacrifice for the sheep, which is you and I, on the cross. The Messiah redeems the remnant, and the sovereign rule of Jehovah is restored. Now, who is the remnant here? Well, from the perspective of Zechariah, the remnant would be those believing, the believing part of Israel will be redeemed, that is purchased, they will be saved, and the sovereign rule of Jehovah will be restored in Israel. Now, that brings us to the end of our look at the introductory material to the book of Zechariah. So in our next lesson, we're going to start right into the book of Zechariah and take a look at what this book will tell us about the Messiah, about the coming of the end, and all the events that are involved with it.